One of our most frequently asked questions when it comes to planting a wine cap bed is how much spawn should I use and will it make a difference? To answer this, we created 7 plots planted with different spawn types and quantities of wine cap spawn. Each plot was about 4 by 4 feet and constructed in the following manner. We started by spreading out wood chips to 2 inches in depth. We then took the spawn type we were using and spread the entire amount over the wood chips. We then covered the spawn with an additional 2 to 3 inches of wood chips. Here at Field & Forest Products, we carry wine cap spawn in 3 different mediums. We have wine cap sawdust spawn, wine cap millet spawn, and wine cap peg spawn. The plots were as follows. Plot 1, we planted with 5.5 pounds of wine cap sawdust spawn. Plot 2, we planted with just about half of that amount, using 2.5 pounds of sawdust spawn. Plot 3, 2 bottles of wine cap millet spawn. Plot 4, 1 bottle of wine cap millet spawn. Plot 5, we used 30 wine cap pegs. And plot 6, we used 15 wine cap pegs. Another frequently asked question we have is, can I just continue to add new material to an existing bed to perpetuate the life of that bed? While in theory the answer is yes, we wanted to demonstrate what happens when you use mycelium that has already been out in the elements for several years. This brings us to plot 7. Plot 7, we did not add any new spawn, but we went to a 2-year-old wine cap bed and dug up some of the heavily myceliated wood chips to transfer to a new bed to monitor the difference between older mycelium and fresh, vigorous spawn. It is now June, and we are back looking at our wine cap beds that we planted with different inoculation rates to see which ones have produced mushrooms first. First and foremost, it's important to note that we had a very unusual spring this year. We had snow up until May 1st, and then after that we had an extremely dry spell, so everything was a little bit delayed. While usually we see our first wine cap make an appearance in May, this year they all held off until June. Our first plot was a 5.5 pound bag of sawdust spawn inoculated into a 16 square foot bed. Not surprisingly, this was the first bed to produce wine cap mushrooms. We actually missed the first crop, which is why the caps are so sun-bleached and cracked. The second plot was planted with 2.5 pounds of sawdust spawn, a little less than half of the first bed. As you can see, no mushrooms yet, but that doesn't mean that the bed is unhealthy. Next up, we have our bed that we inoculated with 2 bottles of wine cap grain spawn. This bed is also starting to produce those wine cap mushrooms. With this particular specimen, you can even see that heavy white mycelium on the wood chips that have reached the surface top and were pushed up by the emerging wine cap. Our fourth plot, the one we planted with just 1 bottle of millet spawn, has yet to produce mushrooms. Like the bed that only has 2.5 pounds of sawdust spawn, this bed is healthy and happy, judging by the mycelium, but again just not yet fully colonized, so therefore not ready to start producing mushrooms. Our remaining 3 beds have yet to produce mushrooms as well. These beds were planted with peg spawn, 2 bags of peg spawn, and then just a transfer from an older bed. Peg spawn is notoriously slow, so it's of no surprise that they haven't produced mushrooms yet, as it usually takes close to 12 months. And the bed that had the mycelium transferred from an already existing older bed is also not surprising to see it hasn't produced yet, as even a vigorous mycelium can peter out over time, so it's just a little bit weaker and taking its time colonizing the bed. We will continue to follow the progress of these beds throughout the season, making note of when the mushrooms fruit and noticing the difference that spawn inoculation rates make. Hey everyone, fast forward a couple months. The last time I videoed, it was early June, and we had just started to see wine cap produce in our wine cap plots. We saw mushrooms first in our bed that had a 5.5 pound inoculation rate with sawdust spawn, and then we also saw mushrooms in the bed planted with 2 bottles of millet spawn. Not long afterwards, by the end of June, we saw mushrooms start to pop up in the bed that had 2.5 pounds of sawdust spawn. At the same time, we also saw mushrooms pop up in plot 4 with 1 bottle of millet spawn. What's interesting about this is by the end of June, we had mushrooms growing in all plots that we had planted with both sawdust and millet spawn. This left us with plots 5, 6, and 7 having yet to produce mushrooms, the plots planted with wine cap peg spawn and then a spawn transfer plot. This isn't particularly surprising to us, as sawdust spawn and millet spawn, you're actually using a higher volume of spawn than you are with any of the peg spawn varieties. With sawdust spawn, you're spreading many small points from which mycelium can grow. Here's a peg spawn. This is 1 point of inoculation in compared to a bag of sawdust spawn, which spreads mycelium across the entire bed. By the time mid-July came by, we had our first fruiting in our plot 5, the one with 30 pegs. So end of July rolls around, and that leaves us with 2 of our 7 plots not having fruited, the one with 15 wine cap pegs, as well as the plot with the spawn transfer. Here we are mid-August, and we are seeing our first fruiting in plot 6, the plot planted with 15 wine cap pegs. So at this point, you may be wondering what this means for overall wine cap yields. And surprisingly, the yield themselves doesn't vary that much between beds. So while plot 6 took the longest to start producing mushrooms out of all the freshly inoculated beds, it's having a fair amount of fruiting right now. While in plot 1, the first bed to start producing mushrooms, we see no new growth at this time. This bed will almost certainly produce more mushrooms, but it will likely now line up to all of the other beds as well. Now that all the beds are fully colonized, they will be really tied into what the weather is doing, the environmental swings of temperature and humidity that stimulate mushrooms to fruit. So this means that overall the yields are actually going to be about the same. The main difference comes in with how long it takes to see your first fruiting. With that being said, let's go back to plot 7, our spawn transfer plot. Remember, this bed had no new mycelium planted into it, just mycelium transferred from an old plot. And once you dig around into it, you do find that mycelium, that nice thready white material, showing that this bed is being colonized. As a matter of fact, out of this bed right now, we have 1 singular lone mushroom. This bed will produce mushrooms with just a spawn transfer, but it does take quite a while as the mycelium is no longer as vigorous as it was when it was fresh and young. But keep in mind, it's not necessarily the productivity of the bed that will change, but rather the time in which you see your first mushroom crop. So if patience is not a virtue that you possess, use more spawn and you'll see mushrooms faster.